Sure. Well, let's start with the genocidal statements. So, without a doubt, there are a lot of unfortunate things that Israeli leaders said, and I'm not going to dwell on most of them. I think a lot of them have been exaggerated, though there were some that certainly crossed the line and that I condemn. The one that I want to talk about is Amalek, which is really a confusion of two different sources. When we say to remember what Amalek did to us, let's remember where that is in the Bible. That comes in the book of Deuteronomy, the fifth book in the five books of Moses. And that is a general statement made after an act of anti-Semitic violence, an outburst of pogrom or Holocaust, like the attacks on October 7th. When you're talking about the incitement to wipe out every man, woman, and child, that comes in a different part of the Bible. It comes in the prophetic part, which is many, many books away, and is a completely different category than the Amalek that Jews traditionally cite. That slogan, remember what Amalek did to you, you will find in Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. Nobody interprets it there to mean the genocide of the Germans. It means to remember the acts of anti-Semitic violence that the Nazis did to you. Now, in terms of Israel's conduct, let's talk first about the dead. I am a pro-Israel commentator who has the distinction of saying from the beginning that I believe Hamas's numbers are basically correct. So they say that 42,000 people died. Foster talks about getting flack for coming on this debate. I would get a lot of flack from other pro-Israel voices that would say that, Hamas is making up numbers. I don't think that Hamas is making up numbers. Perhaps that number is a bit exaggerated, but something like 42,000 people have died. Where you can debate that number is the lack of distinction made by Hamas between civilians and combatants, by the way, including children aged 15, 16, 17, 18, who are taking up weapons for Hamas. Since I believe Hamas's numbers, I can also say I believe Israel's numbers, which has cited something like 20,000 dead combatants killed. So that means that there's about a 1-to-1 combatant to civilian ratio when you divide the death total between the two. That is not genocidal. Now, in terms of starvation, it's true, sadly, unfortunately, disgracefully, that food and water were cut off from entering Gaza in the first weeks of the war. Since the first weeks of the war, that has not been the case. And ample food has gotten into Gaza, ample medicine, including something like 650,000 polio vials, which were administered to the children of Gaza. So if Israel had been starving the Gazans since October, surely we would see visible signs of that starvation. We would see children with bloated bellies, or with visible ribs, or we'd see piles of bodies. Well, where are the bodies? And I say the same thing to people peddling the starvation libel that I would to, the anti-vax crowd back during the days of COVID. They said, well, the COVID vaccine is going to kill people. Where are the bodies? Where are all the people who died from the COVID vaccine? Where are all the people who have died from a nearly 1-year campaign of Israeli starvation? Something like 70 trucks a day are entering. That is a sufficient amount. Even Kenneth Roth, who is no friend of Israel, he's the former director of Human Rights Watch. He admits there's no starvation, there's no famine, there's no deaths. In a debate recently, he bizarrely claimed that Israel is masking its starvation efforts by entering food into Gaza. So we don't have the deaths that we need. Now, in terms of that 200,000 figure, that isn't a serious figure. That was put into a magazine, which is a serious magazine, but not as a peer-reviewed article, but rather as a letter. It's tangentious. It's made by people who are peddling propaganda for Hamas. It's not a number that has been picked up by major news organizations like CNN or the New York Times, which have stuck to Hamas's number. Now, how does Hamas get its number? I think it gets it scientifically. People show up, corpses show up, or they show up with pieces of their children or relatives, and Hamas adds it to the tally. And that tally is something like 42,000, again, without distinguishing between civilians and combatants. And Palestinians have had to make up numbers and inflate figures because they're dissatisfied with that 40,000 figure. They're dissatisfied with the figure of 20,000 civilians killed in 12 months of war. That's something like 1,200 civilians per month. So what we're seeing is not war crimes. What we're seeing is not starvation. It's just war. And war is hell. And the best way to prevent war is to push the Palestinians to accept a two-state solution, to live in peace with the Jews, and to stop their absurd and pointless campaign and self-destructive campaign of trying to annihilate the Israeli settlement, the Jewish settlement in Israel.